Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. The United States has resumed its drones program in Pakistan, with 2 strikes on militant strongholds in the North Waziristan tribal region, killing at least 16 suspected militants. This comes only days after a militant attack on Karachi airport, where 39 people were killed, including the 10 attackers. Washington had agreed to suspend its drones program back in December. This was to allow Islamabad to pursue peace talks with the Pakistani Taliban. But pressure has been mounting on the Pakistani authorities to launch a ground offensive in North Waziristan amid a breakdown in peace talks. Staying in the region, and in Iraq in particular, Iraqi Kurdish forces say they have taken full control of the northern oil city of Kirkuk as the army flees before an Islamist offensive nearby. The Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, or ISIS, has seized control of the western half of Mosul, which is Iraq's second largest city. As many as 500,000 people have been forced to flee the city of Mosul after hundreds of Islamist militants took control of it. But this and the attacks in Pakistan have sent shockwaves across the region. With the inroads that ISIS has made in Iraq, coupled with attacks by the Pakistani Taliban, what can be the international response to this strain of militant Islamism in this part of the world? What kind of threat does it pose to regional security? To discuss this, I'm joined by Dr. James Caron, who is a lecturer in Islamicate South Asia at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Professor Saad Jawad, a senior visiting fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics. Also here is Kamal Alam, who is a visiting fellow at military academies in Britain, Pakistan and Syria. On the line, we're joined from New York by Pir Zubair Shah, who is a freelance journalist, and Margaret Gilmore, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. With regard to this particular attack in Karachi at the airport, I mean, what kind of message do you think this sent out?
I think the message that they're giving is that they're very much there, because for the last 3-4 months, the civilian government's been trying to negotiate with the Taliban, and it hasn't really worked. And for the last few weeks, there's a lot of talk in Pakistan that the Taliban have been divided. There's infighting, different clans fighting each other in North Waziristan. As a result, I think this was basically a message saying we're still here and there might be infighting, but we still have a capacity to launch big attacks on Pakistani institutions.
Pierre, can you explain this particular split?
Basically, the split is first of all ideological. The group which is led by Fazlullah, the former Taliban commander in Swat, they are more hardliners and they are very close to some of the sectarian groups and they are involved in sectarian attacks. While the infighting is within the Masouds, which is a tribe of Pashtun tribe of South Waziristan, and which has been providing the top leadership to the Taliban all these years, to the Pakistani Taliban. So the infighting is within the Masouds over territory and over financial resources, especially in the city like Karachi. But I don't think they are fighting. The two groups which have now split are not fighting against each other. It's very localized issue, while the main faction, the central faction led by Fazlullah, is still much spread out in the country, as we saw. They attacked in Karachi and they have attacks in Punjab where they killed 2 army colonels. The split is very much limited to Waziristan only for the time being.
I see. And the leader, Maulana Fazlullah, was mentioned there, James. Do we know much about the command and control structure? I mean, this particular attack on the Karachi airport, I suppose what's muddied the waters for some people is that apparently it was Uzbek militants that had carried it out. I'm just wondering what you know about the command and control structure.
So the Taliban structure in Pakistan, I'm not sure that too many people know too much about it. The movement as a whole is a sort of piecemeal thing. It was spread between all the different agencies in Pakistan, as well as tribal agencies in Pakistan, as well as other territories like Swat. There is a central sort of structure which links together what are essentially local public opinion and public opinion movements with local characteristics, which flow out of the sort of local political economy of patronage of the areas. With regard to the Uzbek fighters, places like North Waziristan in particular have attracted a good deal of sort of militants from the entire Islamic world, particularly from places like Uzbekistan or Chechnya, where Islamic movements have been outlawed. This is because North Waziristan and other places in the tribal areas on the border with Afghanistan have more or less been under Taliban control for a good while. And second, they are on sort of international trade routes between port cities of Karachi and sort of the rest of Central Asia.
Margaret, I suppose what is also confusing for us here in the West, certainly, the difference between the Pakistani Taliban and the Taliban we hear about in Afghanistan, and the spectre of that was certainly raised with the prisoner swap that the Obama administration undertook with 5 Afghan Taliban members.
Listening to what the panel have been saying shows the huge difficulty we have not only in this region but in Iraq and various other places on who are we dealing with. And when we do decide to come down, or when the West decides to come down and help one side, do they really know who they're talking to? And if they send in help, for example, the Americans sending in military help to the Iraqi government, can they guarantee that that's where that military help will stay? Or will it, as happened this week, end up in the hands of the jihadists who've been displaying military vehicles and weapons provided by the US in Mosul in their hands? So I think that's the biggest difficulty for the West. Who are you dealing with in these shifting sands when so much is going on? I think that's one of the problems. And one of the other problems, you mentioned the prisoners there, is that where you do have somebody take over, even if it's in quite a small area, a regional area or a town, and they go for the prisoner releases, we've seen this in the Mosul area, they are then taking on, the extremists are then taking on, a huge number of extra recruits, if you like, people who will be on side with them, exacerbating a problem and shifting balances again in a situation which is already volatile.
Pierre, I'd be very, very interested in your take on the news that the United States has resumed its drones program, because I know you've written about the drone program, and you seem to think that, well, really, the problems with the Pakistani Taliban stem from that.
Now I see a convergence of, can say, like the Americans have killed Uzbeks and some Punjabi Taliban, which the Pakistanis are also somehow fighting, because, as I mentioned earlier, in this split within the TTP, the Fazlullah, the Uzbeks and the foreigners, they are with this Fazlullah faction of the Taliban. And that's the faction which has been involved in recent attacks against Pakistani security forces and the Karachi airport. So here I see a convergence of interest where the Americans have chimed in and they have attacked Uzbeks and Taliban and according to some reports, Haqqani network fighters. So here it's a convergence in which both sides will benefit, in the sense that Americans are killing not only their own enemies, which are the Haqqani network, but also groups like the Uzbeks, which are now a direct threat to Pakistan and are conducting attacks inside Pakistan. The Americans, I think there will be definitely a nod from the Pakistani military. At this stage, there will be little political fallout for the government of Pakistan in case of these drone attacks. Also, I think it will help Pakistan in getting rid of some of the Taliban commanders. And as we have seen, Pakistan itself hasn't killed a single Taliban commander in more than this 1 decade of war. So the drones have been in the past very effective. As we see in North Waziristan, a lot of displacement is taking place. People are leaving their houses and they are coming to the cities where there is no infrastructure to support them.
Can I just ask about the Haqqani network, though, to Kamal? I mean, the Haqqani network that Pierre was talking about, Waziristan has been a basis, or at least a stronghold for them. The Afghanistan's Haqqani network, I suppose it raises the question of what kind of links there are between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban.
It was very confusing because on the surface of it, there are no links between them. However, on paper, they swear allegiance to Mullah Omar, the leader of the Afghan Taliban. But he has publicly distanced himself from the Pakistani Taliban on numerous occasions over the last few years. The Haqqani network itself, a senior member of the Haqqani network was killed in Islamabad, the capital of the country, which shows you whoever killed him, it was blamed on Afghan intelligence. The kind of murky world between the Afghan Taliban, Haqqani network and the TTP, it's spread out between both countries. The Pakistan military has wanted to do an operation for quite a while in North Waziristan. However, the civilian government has been holding them back. The debate within Pakistan, if you look at the media debates where you get a lot of military officials and civilian officials coming, it's utterly confusing. And the relations have never been good between the current Prime Minister and the army. And that actually plays into the Haqqani network and the Taliban debate. The Prime Minister is seen to be a sympathizer of the Taliban. Some people even talk that he's done a deal that they don't attack Punjab. And actually the attacks in Punjab are very, very limited compared to the attacks in the frontier, in Karachi and other parts of the country. And that's why the Taliban are getting strong, because unless the civilian government gives a clear green light to the army to go ahead and get rid of them, you will keep seeing the Taliban attacking in different cities.
So, James, I mean, the Prime Minister, Mr. Nawaz Sharif, he is still trying to negotiate some kind of peace accord, though, isn't he? And how successful do you think that could possibly be? I mean, does he have the support of the military? What do they want?
Nawaz Sharif is still trying to negotiate a peace deal, as far as I'm aware. I mean, part of the issue is that while one can negotiate with the central sort of umbrella structure that links together a lot of these piecemeal movements, local movements are only partially sort of integrated into this, and they have their own local autonomous interests and operations to an extent. And B, I mean, within the central structure as well, it's actually rather more fragmented and less disciplined than the Afghan Taliban, and this makes actually negotiating with it rather more difficult. It also, in my opinion, is something that contributes to the resilience and longevity of an insurgency in Pakistan in general.
Pierre, I mean, is there some kind of jostling for influence ahead of the drawdown of troops from Afghanistan in 2016? What kind of impact do you think that is having at the moment?
Every side is repositioning itself to the new reality, which will be like the post-NATO Afghanistan. And the Pakistani Taliban also keep it in mind, at least some factions of it. Similarly, the things have changed, like the Arabs, mostly the Al-Qaeda fighters, they have left the tribal areas. And the Afghan Taliban, they are also not in that position as they were before 9/11. And Pakistan itself, Pakistan has as much concerns with the continued American presence in Afghanistan as, for example, Al-Qaeda Taliban would have. So they are also repositioning itself. That's why they are talking to some of the factions, because they cannot keep fighting all the locals, especially. So that's why there is an effort to separate the local Taliban from the foreigners one, which are then easy to eliminate because it's not their home, it's not their country. And there wouldn't be that much resistance if the Pakistanis went against them, or if they cooperated with the Americans, in case we saw yesterday where the Uzbeks were killed.
In what way are the Americans helping out militarily apart from drone warfare? I mean, is that their sole response?
In the past, they have provided Pakistan with, for example, night vision goggles and other gadgets and armored vehicles. So this support has been going on. And beside that, also you have to keep in mind Pakistan, especially the military, they also use the situation in the tribal areas for its political, for domestic and international political and financial benefits. So unless the coalition support fund, which is in billions of dollars, it continues to flow, the Pakistanis, at least, they will be giving this semblance of fighting that they are undertaking against the Taliban. So my point is that every side, from Afghan Taliban to Pakistani Taliban to the Pakistani military and to the Pakistani government, everyone is realigning themselves to a scenario where there won't be much of foreign military presence in Afghanistan.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia, in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing the threat of militant Islamism in Pakistan and Iraq. With me is Dr. James Caron, a lecturer in Islamicate South Asia at SOAS, Professor Saad Jawad, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics, Kamal Alam, a Visiting Fellow at military academies in Britain, Pakistan and Syria. On the line, we're joined from New York by Pir Zubair Shah, who is a freelance journalist, and Margaret Gilmore, a Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI. And Margaret, I mean, what does this mean for security in that part of between Afghanistan and Pakistan for the United States? Clearly, if drone warfare is being resumed after a hiatus of several months, it's a very secretive program, but the United States has a vested interest in keeping it stable, especially given it has troops in Afghanistan, at least, neighbouring Pakistan, until 2016.
But I also think that their interests are moving elsewhere, and the policy now is to pull back as much as possible, to be very cautious about who they're giving equipment to, and to ensure that they are not creating a problem back home. And I think that's the problem for the UK as well. They're in a way more concerned now in Britain with what's happening in places like Syria or in other parts of the world, Somalia, where we are seeing what happened before in Afghanistan happening now, where people who are getting angry with what's going on there are going out to fight, getting taken up by those at the extreme, particularly in Syria, and are causing, in the view of the agencies, the authorities back in the UK, a big problem. And that's a problem not just for the UK, it's happening all over Europe in particular. People going out there, coming back, are they going to come back angry? Have they been trained up by people like ISIS, Al-Qaeda-linked groups, to bring the battle back home? A big worry, and one that the intelligence agencies in the UK certainly are seeing as a problem that could be the big problem of the next generation.
And I mentioned earlier on the recent release of Taliban prisoners from Guantanamo seems to have whipped up a degree of hysteria, I guess, among certainly the Western media and kind of equating the Taliban with Al-Qaeda. This confusion, perhaps one might say, is what led in the first place to the United States to invade Iraq, and that's where I move on to now. And joining me with to talk about that, Professor Saeed Jawad, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics. And with the news this morning about the inroads that ISIS are making in Iraq, I'm just wondering, why do you think ISIS is winning? What are they doing right? It's a relatively small force of some 15,000 people.
The main problem was, of course, when the invasion took place and the decision was taken to disband the old Iraqi army and all the security forces, and then re-establishing an army depending on quota system, sectarian militias, and so on and so forth, without proper training, without proper armament. All the armaments of the old Iraqi army were either destroyed or sold to Iran or somewhere else in the black market. So the Iraqis, or the Iraqi state, does not have a real army. This is the first problem. Yeah. The second problem is that the Syrian spillover and the good fighting spirit these people are having in Syria is giving them an impetus to come back and fight in Iraq. And the third thing is that the sectarian policy of the Iraqi government have encouraged a lot of local people to either support or join or fight with, or at least turn a blind eye on the activities of ISIL and other Al-Qaeda related organizations, because they think that they are defending, between two brackets, the Sunnis against, two brackets, the Shia government.
Margaret, do you see this as a consequence of the spillover from Syria? I mean, could the West be ruining its inability to intervene there?
I definitely think that, the more lawlessness you've got in Syria, the more anger you're getting whipped up, the more spillover you're going to get between these different organizations, and the more those at the extreme are going to exploit the situation. And with the West increasingly reluctant to intervene, you're going to see Iraq inevitably to the people who are more willing to help them, and that is Iran and Russia, for example. So we're going to see, again, a shift in the balance there, and that's a very difficult one. But I think this extremism, definitely, the situation is so dire, the humanitarian situation is so dire in Syria, people are going over there wanting to help, getting more and more angry at the West refusing to do to give military help, which really is perhaps, in the view of some, the only solution. And as such, they're becoming radicalized, more extreme themselves, and then you have this spillover within the region.
You're listening to Radio VR, the voice of Russia in London. We're discussing the threat of militant Islamism in Iraq and Pakistan with James Caron, Saad Jawad, Kamal Alam, Pir Zubair Shah and Margaret Gilmore. Kamal, I'm just wondering what you think about the spillover from Syria, because actually ISIS is really fighting on quite a few different fronts at the moment, and it's trying to take over portions of rebel-held areas in Syria at the same time as it's making inroads into Iraq. Are they overstretching themselves?
Well, I think the reason they're moving into Iraq is because they're losing in Syria. I think the Syrian army's done a very good job in retaking key strategic territories. And also, a lot of the people the lands where ISIS were and other parts of Al-Qaeda were in Syria, they've done some, pretty atrocious things, which basically led them, a lot of the locals didn't like them. There are a lot of foreigners fighting in Syria. And this is where the connectivity to the Pakistan war is very important. It's been reported publicly that, people from the Pakistan-Afghan border have been going to Syria. Just recently, Turkey has had a lot of problems on their border issue as well. So I think the flow of foreign fighters into Syria, them not being accepted by the local Syrians and the Syrian military doing a good job in fighting the terrorists has made it difficult, for them in Syria. So as a result, that gives them a bit of impetus to go into Iraq. And like the good professor said, the Iraqi army and the Iraqi state their sectarian policies has alienated a lot of Sunni Arabs in Iraq. And especially the Syria-Iraq border, where you have very similar, Arab Sunni tribes living side by side. There is a lot of anger there. So it spills over into Iraq on tribal lines, sectarian lines, and so also the lack of state.
One small observation. The ICIL in Syria is not similar as to the ICIL we are seeing now in Iraq, because I think there are a lot of Iraqi elements, local Iraqi elements, and members of the old army and old Ba'ath party involved in this. The reaction or the measures taken by the people in Mosul are very much different than what Daesh or ICIL did in Syria. Or there is no execution, street execution, there is no burning of Christian churches, there is no harassment to the people. Indeed, they are doing the contrary. They are calling the people to go back to work. They have appointed an Iraqi governor from the old Iraqi army to Mosul. So I think there is a difference between the two organizations, two groups. Maybe the initial attack was by the people from Syria, coming from Syria, but then it was the initiative was taken up by Iraqis inside Iraq, and that's why they had. I cannot imagine Daesh taking Mosul and then going to Tikrit and then to Kirkuk in one day. This is impossible. But I believe there are other organizational tribal elements loyal or cooperating with Daesh that made this movement possible.
James, it sounds like there are competing ideologies here. Do you think that these kind of competing ideologies are at loggerheads with each other, or is there some kind of common ground?
There may be competing ideologies. In fact, there's quite a few of them. However, many of the factions, at least in Afghanistan, are united at least on the idea of a unified Afghanistan without American forces in it. As well, a lot of them are unified on the idea of Islamic social justice. In Pakistan, similar things are the case. And this is a case regardless of whether people adhere to ideologically rigid positions or are actually just interacting in the movement for opportunistic reasons. That is to say, even when people are operating in the movement for opportunistic reasons, they tend to have a sort of anti-imperial ideology that they're operating with, which makes it sort of more legitimate than other opportunistic pursuits would be.
But a lot of the fighters in Iraq are from the West. There's people from all over, from Britain even. What is their focus? What do they want to see in Iraq?
Well, they certainly want to have a place to express their opinion from. As they are saying now, we are trying to build a united Sunni bloc to face the Shiite sectarian policy of the government. Others are saying that we are moving to Baghdad to remove the regime and establish a more balanced one. So there are different declarations about that, but it's certainly the failure of the government to solve all these pending problems for the last 8 years, especially the Sunni-Shia relations, the Arab-Kurdish relations, is the cause of this problem.
So has Nouri al-Maliki been it completely ineffective? Has he been too divisive?
What's happening is the result of his policy, and he's been incompetent in dealing with most of the issues facing the Iraqi government. The problem with him, he creates a problem but never solves any problem. He created problems with the Kurdish political parties. He created problems with Al-Anbar, and then he resorted to the military forces. When he failed to solve this problem militarily, he went back and said, we are going to have negotiations. His main issue now is a third term, despite the opposition to this, and these are all the problems of his government, his administration, and the people around him.
Pierre, what's going on in Iraq as opposed to Pakistan, I suppose it's raised the spectre of the 2003 invasion. And I'm just wondering, how relevant do you think that 2003 invasion is to, say, what's happening in Mosul right now?
The thing is that, of course, if there are jihadi victories in Iraq, they will definitely boost the morale of some of the groups operating in the border areas and with Afghanistan. But as I mentioned earlier, already the foreign fighters have been leaving to other theaters, especially to Syria and Iraq. With their victories in such places and their movement getting stronger, more people will be joining them. It will help to, in a way, because there will be only locals left in the tribal areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan and Afghanistan itself, which will be then easy to deal with by the respective governments in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Professor Jawad, from what you're saying, it seems that you seem to suggest that really Iraq can't move on with Mr. Maliki as a leader.
Definitely. With the amount of opposition he's facing now, it does not seem that he will be able to govern unless, and that's why he is asking the parliament now for state of security and emergency state of security in order to prolong his term in office.
So what does ISIS do now? Will they march on Baghdad, and will they ever get any kind of support from key Gulf states, Saudi Arabia,
I don't
Kuwait?
I don't think these key Gulf states will help this movement as such to go and occupy Baghdad. I think in the coming few days, one should wait until the coming few days to see whether they really have managed to take other areas like they are claiming, because there are now contradicting claims. The government claims that it had taken back Tikrit or Salahuddin, and they are saying we're still occupying Tikrit. There are contradicting claims about Beiji, their oil refinery states. Until one part or the other retake these areas, we cannot say how far this will go on.
And as 15,000 fighters, is that enough to challenge a state?
No. This is ridiculous. They are not even 15,000. And the number that attacked Mosul is even less than that. But the sudden collapse of the Iraqi very strong military presence there and the running away of their leaders and commanders caused this collapse and this defeat.
Just back to Pakistan before we finish. Kamal, how do you see that playing out? Do you see further attacks imminent?
Yes, I think in the short run there will be a lot of attacks. The Taliban have announced that as well. I mean, the Air Force is attacking on a daily basis, their F-16s. There will be reaction, there will be attacks in the city in the short run, and it will be messy. However, I think in the long run, the military will have to go in there on the major ground offensive, unfortunately, which would then mean a lot of people would be displaced, like Pierre Zubair said. The big cities don't have the infrastructure to take the internally displaced people. Also, the civil-military rift doesn't help. I mean, I was in Razmok, North Waziristan, just a month ago. The Pakistan army is there. They know what to do. But the problem is there's a lot of pressure on them from all sides. And, of course, there was the prisoner swap happening. I think the American-Pakistani cooperation is very important in the fights on the border. And I think it's more positive than negative. They can get them out, but they need a clear message from the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who I think is very hesitant on a military operation.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Sadly, we've run out of time, but thanks for joining me. That's Kamal Alam, visiting fellow at military academies in Britain, Pakistan and Syria. Also here in the studio, Dr. James Caron, a lecturer in Islamic South Asia at SOAS, and Professor Saad Jawad, senior visiting fellow at the Middle East Centre at the LSE. On the line, Pir Zubair Shah, a freelance journalist on the line from New York, and Margaret Gilmore, Senior Associate Fellow at RUSI. Thank you for joining me, Brendan Cole, here on The Voice of Russia in London.